one of the advantages of preparing sermons in advance, which is what I often do, I sort of work a couple weeks ahead. Obviously, it helps you, you get stuff done and you can put a little extra time in and spread that out, and there's some advantages to that. One of the disadvantages is that you get a sermon all done and prepared and ready, and then circumstances can change sort of last minute. And that's what I found happening this week. I had this sermon already on coveting and contentment and rejoicing and all of those important themes. And then you wake up on Tuesday morning and it was as dark as night, and you hear word on the news about how devastating these fires had been, and all of a sudden all these ideas about contentment and rejoicing sounded all different. And so I was kind of left wondering, now what do we do with that? I mean, you bring a message that says, hey, be content, rejoice in the midst of, the circumstances that we're all in the middle of. And you don't want to come in and sound glib or, too flippant about it. But on the other hand, that I got to thinking that, I do think there's still a way that this all actually fits together. And I think there's a way that that Paul's words here in Philippians really speak to our present moment. And I think it's a way that actually helps us maybe to experience this kind of contentment, this kind of deeper joy that we maybe are longing for and needing even in times of uncertainty. I mean, we're not just talking the past week, but even the past, whatever it is, 6-7 months that we've been in the midst of the whole coronavirus pandemic. So I think this actually makes sense to kind of reflect on. I want to kind of bring these pieces together. I do want to talk a little bit about coveting, because we're bringing our whole summer-long series on the Ten Commandments. We're bringing that all kind of to a close this morning. I'll talk a little bit about that, but then I'm going to lead us into thinking through what contentment means. And I think you'll see that those two things do fit together. And the way we're going to do it, we're going to look at the dangers of discontentment, and then we're going to move into how do we experience the peace that God alone can give us, and then finally, how do we learn contentment? How do we learn to practice contentment no matter what else may be going on around us? So we'll start with discontentment, we'll look at then peace, and then we'll look at how do we experience contentment. Now, question and answer 113, which is what we just read a couple minutes ago, reminds us and kind of shows us that really what coveting is. When the Bible talks about coveting, it's addressing desire, right? It's sort of desiring something that you don't have. It's letting your heart lock onto something that is not in your possession, and then you want it so badly that you might be willing to do anything to get it. Now, and that's, of course, that's, I think, how we most often think about coveting. It's wanting something you don't have. Now, our culture, I think, cultivates the need to compare ourselves. Right? Have you noticed that? I mean, especially social media and all those things. Social media really promotes this idea of coveting. Because when you go online, when you begin to see pictures and images of how everybody else is living, you begin to see the vacations that they're taking. You begin to see their perfect families. You begin to see their job promotions and academic success and athletic success. And of course, you don't see any of the stuff that people don't ever post on social media. You don't ever see, the fact that mom and dad aren't getting along very well right now, or you got maybe an A on this class, but you're actually getting D's and F's and all those others. And so you don't ever see that. You just kind of see the perfect image that people like to project. And what can happen pretty soon is you begin to want what other people have. You begin to be jealous and envious, and you want that for yourself. And pretty soon, you become way less satisfied with what you have. Right? You begin to look at the vacations that other people are taking, and your trip, down to Eugene or wherever. I'm not trying to badmouth Eugene, but wherever, it begins to just look not as enjoyable because you start to compare yourself, and you begin to want what other people have. Right? Now, that's how we often think about coveting. And that's a very real, I think, threat, problem, issue that we need to be mindful of, especially when you're on social media, right? You've got to be really tuned into that temptation to covet. But I got to thinking, again, looking around at the way things are this past week, these last 6 months, this whole year, and I began to wonder a little bit about a different way of what it means to desire something outside of God's will. In other words, look at it this way. If somehow God could give you the pen and paper to write your own story, your own life, if you could describe and outline how your whole life was going to go, I think most of us in this room would not include the kinds of hard stuff that we've gone through this past week. We wouldn't write disasters into the story. We wouldn't write, pandemics. We wouldn't write a life story that involves a whole lot of adversity or loss or suffering or grief, right? We might include a little of that because, you can't have it perfect, but the truth is most of us wouldn't want to write the kind of adversity that we've gone through the last few months. Most of us would rather have life go fairly simply. And so what can happen is you begin to kind of look at life the way it is. You begin to look at, the challenges that we face, the disappointments. You begin to look at the way that, all the things that you'd hoped to do this year, all the experiences that you'd hoped to have, and they all got kind of taken away. And you begin to look at that, and it's one thing to be disappointed, which I think is a very appropriate response. It's one thing to sort of grieve the loss of things that you couldn't do. But what can happen is your disappointment can turn to bitterness, right? Your disappointment can turn to sort of this hardened anger that things didn't go the way you wanted. Your plans didn't work out. Your hopes for the way school was going to happen this fall still isn't working out, and all the hopes you wanted to have with your family, vacations and trips and other things, it's not working out, and you get bitter about it. And that bitterness then, so once you move from sort of disappointment to bitterness, it can go to cynicism, can turn into sort of just this hopelessness and this despair, which is to say, in one way, it's to say, God got this wrong. God messed it all up. The plans that, God should have done, he didn't do. Which itself is a kind of coveting, right? It's a way of saying, I know better than God, and I want it, and God should have done it differently. And all of that brings us to the Philippian church. That's kind of our contact point with this Philippian church, because the Philippian church was a church that Paul had this wonderful relationship with them. Paul cared for them deeply. The Philippian church in turn loved Paul very much. They had a very warm and affectionate relationship. And after Paul plants this church, and he sort of then goes on his way, and he commits to coming back and visiting them again. But those plans got interrupted. And they got interrupted because Paul was arrested and was put in jail, put in prison. And that did something to the Philippians. That was kind of followed that cycle of, disappointment. But it also kind of sunk in more deeply than that. It led to just this discouragement and this weariness and this sense of hopelessness. And the people are questioning, why in the world would God allow our faith leader, our good friend Paul, to be thrown in jail? Why would God allow him to suffer like that? Some were angry. You kind of get that sense based on some of the things Paul says throughout the letter. They were questioning God. They were bitter. That was beginning to turn into quarreling and fighting. There's bickering going on in the church. You just get the sense that this is a church that, because of all that's happened, they've grown discouraged. They've grown weary. They've become, maybe they're getting towards bitterness as well. And So Paul has this task of, as the pastor and spiritual caretaker, he has to address this church. And he has to say something that's going to help them through this time. And I think if it were anyone other than someone like Paul, it would be really hard to take Paul or to take seriously. Because what Paul says, and we'll get to it in a minute, Paul says, hey, rejoice. And I have to tell you, every time I hear that and read that, or just kind of spend a little time reflecting on that, there's a part of me that wants to say, Paul's being, maybe insensitive. Because here's these people, they're hurting, they're struggling, they're weary, they're discouraged, and Paul just says, hey, rejoice. But I'll tell you, Paul has the credibility to say that. And that's what helps, because Paul, here's someone that has, he's writing from prison, for one thing. So it's not like Paul is, kind of Pollyanna, right? Like everything is great and just be happy. No, Paul's in prison. And Paul's been shipwrecked, and he's been beaten, and he's been mistreated, and he's been ridiculed, and he's experienced, personal failures in his own life, and so on and so forth. And so Paul is someone that's really gone through adversity himself. He suffered in all kinds of ways, probably in ways, in fact, not probably, definitely in ways that most of us could never imagine. So that gives Paul the credibility to speak to us. So in the midst of this discontentment, in the midst of this uncertainty, in the midst of maybe what we could call a form of coveting where you want things to go differently than they are, what does Paul say? Paul says, rejoice. Rejoice in the Lord always, verse 4. Now, Paul knows, I think, that the moment he says to a church that's weary and discouraged and hurting and frustrated and struggling, he's going to come on, he's going to say rejoice. He knows right away there's going to be, figuratively anyways, a lot of hands that go up and say, wait a minute. Are you serious, Paul? Really? You want us to rejoice? And so Paul repeats himself. Yes, let me say it again, rejoice. In those days, of course, you don't have Microsoft Word or Google Docs or whatever, and so you can't bold print or italicize or underline stuff that you want people to really pay attention to. Right? You're writing on pen and parchment. And so when you want to really emphasize something, what do? You write it a second time. You write it twice. And that's a big deal because, just a little historical context here, of course, you're writing on parchment and your space is very limited. It's not like you can just go buy another ream of paper at Office Depot. You've got parchment and it's, you got to maximize the space. And so when you repeat something, it's because you really, really want to drive the point home. So Paul says, rejoice. Yeah, I know there's going to be a lot of you that think I've lost my marbles, but yes, rejoice. Rejoice. Now, how do we do that? Well, our culture doesn't make it easy. We've already talked about some of the ways that culture drives us to look at other people, right? You see Facebook stuff and you see the kind of the way other people live and you say, boy, my life isn't as good as that. One of the things that, culturally, they've actually studied this. They find that one of the problems that we have looking for happiness is that we're sort of conditioned to measure happiness relative to other people. In other words, it's not just about buying a nice house or taking a nice vacation or owning a nice car or having a happy family or whatever else. Culturally, we do it this way. We say you need to have a nice house better than other people. You need to have a vacation that's really good relative to what other people have experienced. And on it goes. I found a study on this. You'll find this maybe interesting. They did a study. I think they did it during the Barcelona Olympics in 1992. But they've repeated it, and they found pretty consistent results. What they did, and I'll try to simplify it a little bit, they took photos, and I think it was of swimming. So all the swimmers, as soon as they touch the edge of the pool, like to finish their race, and then they look up at the scoreboard to see where did they finish. And in that moment when they're looking at the scoreboard, they take pictures. So the people doing this study gathered dozens probably of photos, and they just showed the photo to a group of probably hundreds and hundreds of people. And they had the people looking at the photos rank happiness on a scale of 1 to 10. So they look at the picture and decide, is that person like really happy, not happy at all, somewhere in the middle? The study proved, or demonstrated, that silver medalists are the least happy people. Now, listen, if you have competed and you've won a silver medal, you should be happy, all right? So don't hear me telling you to be hard on yourself. If you won a silver medal, that beats all my participation ribbons, all right? But here's what they found. So they do a little digging and they find that, okay, if you win gold, well, you're better than everybody. That's the thinking, right? You beat everybody else. You're first. And if you win bronze, it's like, hey, at least I got a medal. But if you win silver, it's like, boy, you were 2/100ths of a second short of the gold. See what's happening there? It's happiness compared to another person. And that's how our culture, it's one of the big ways our culture encourages us to find happiness. But you know what? You do that, you'll never find it. You'll always be just behind someone else. You'll always be just falling short. You'll never, you might be happy for a little while, but then you come along and you find out, wow, someone else has a better experience than I did. They have a nicer house, a nicer car, they have better friends, they have a better life, whatever. And it's always going to be out of reach. So, Paul gives us an alternative here. Rejoice, but he doesn't just say rejoice, he says what? Rejoice in the Lord. Happiness, or more accurately, joy, is not found relative to other people. It's not found in what we do accomplish. It's not found in, but it's found, true joy, biblical joy, is found in pursuit of God. It's found in our enjoyment of our relationship with God. True joy is ours when we seek it in God. St. Augustine wrote about this, and he describes this beautiful passage, and he's got a lot of these and thou, so I'll kind of bring the language a little bit up to date. But Augustine says this, that God gives joy to those who love God for his own sake, whose joy he himself is. In other words, if you want the kind of joy that can sustain you through whatever adversity or trial or difficulty you're going through, that kind of joy is found in relationship with God. It's found in communion with him. Now, you're wondering, well, okay, what does that actually look like? How do you experience that? Well, glad you asked, because Paul tells us that. He actually fleshes that out a little bit in verses 6 and 7. He says, don't be anxious about anything, which right away, that raises questions, doesn't it? Because you think, how do you not be anxious? How do you not worry when you're in the midst of adversity, when you're in the midst of trials and hardships? How do you not worry? Well, Paul goes on, and he says, bring your requests to God with prayer and thanksgiving. You ever had a pebble in your shoe? Isn't that the worst? Like, every time you take a step, there's that little pebble saying, I'm still here, I'm still here. And it's always there until you, of course, take your shoe off, and hopefully you can dump the little pebble out. Worry, anxiousness, concern is the pebble in your shoe that is meant to drive you to God in prayer. Let me say that one more time. Worry is the pebble in your shoe that's meant to drive you to God in prayer. When you worry, whether it's once a day, once an hour, 10 times an hour, whatever it is, use that as the moment that brings you to God in prayer. Use that as a call to prayer, a little reminder. I'm worried, so I need to pray. And Paul tells you there's really two parts to the prayer, two ways that we can pray when you're worried or anxious. First of all, bring your requests to God. Whatever it is that you're worried about, concerned about, anxious about, whether it's someone that you care about, whether it's the uncertainty of your future, whether it's, the stuff we're going through right now. Pray about it. Ask God about it. Make requests of God. Ask for help. And then do that with thanksgiving. Those two things go together. We often get the request part right. Don't we? Like, we all remember to pray about our request, but with thanksgiving. If this is not a magic pill, but if you are someone that does find that you worry a fair bit, learn the discipline of praying prayers of gratitude. Find things to be thankful for. Simple things maybe, small things. But find ways to express gratitude to God. Just make that a discipline. And then Paul tells you, he says, the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds. That's the first time Paul says it. He says it again in a second time, which we'll get to in a minute. But as you begin to pray, as you begin to make your request known to God, as you begin to practice gratitude, you find that God gives you the peace. Now, by the way, it's not something that you yourself can manufacture or create. It's something God gives you. God will give you peace that will guard your hearts and minds. That's the first thing. Paul tells us one more thing we can do to experience peace. He says, whatever is true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, praiseworthy, think about such things. Paul's use of that word think there is not just sort of on a cognitive level, although that would be part of it. It's hard to think without cognition, right? You have to understand stuff, but it's the kind of thinking that leads you to act. Now, we could probably spend 5 minutes on each of those things. We won't. But I'm going to give you, they fall into 3 categories. So I'm going to give you the 3 categories. So that's a deal, right? 3 categories that cover about 6 or 7 different things. The first category is truth. And Paul just comes out and says that. Think about what's true. Now, I single that one out for a moment because what I have noticed in the last 6 months, I think this is actually way more than 6 months, but this has kind of been concentrated in the last 6 months. Truth goes out the window very, very quickly in the midst of crisis. Whether it's stuff related to coronavirus, whether it's stuff related to this past week, the fires, truth disappears very quickly. And the thing is, we don't realize that it's happening. Not one of us thinks, well, I'm buying into stuff that's false. If you knew that, you wouldn't buy into it. But the stuff that circulates on the web, the distortions, the stories that float around, so much of it is not true. And so we need to become experts in pursuing and thinking on what is true. That means considering where we get our news from. Just being careful and mindful of that. For some of us, it might mean that you just get off of social media for a bit. Right now, however you handle this, the fact and remains the same is that we become serious about thinking on what is true. Right? Sometimes it means doing your homework, fact-checking stuff that's floating around on the internet before you spread it and tell other people. Think about what is true. The second category Paul singles out is, we're going to call it righteousness. And Paul uses the words noble, pure, and right. Those are moral categories. Noble, pure, and right. And, in a world where sin is so tolerated, it's applauded, it's approved of. And you know what? If you stand against that and if you oppose what's wrong, you get labeled, you get called, hateful or intolerant or bigoted or whatever else. And it's tempting then to just sort of swim with the current, right? Go along with how everybody else is living. And Paul says, no, don't do that. Think on, act on what is righteous. Right? So truth, righteousness, and then finally the words Paul uses are lovely, admirable, and praiseworthy, which fall under the category, I think, of what is beautiful. Think on beauty. I think this one is one that sometimes gets left behind by Christians. We don't realize the importance of beauty. The words, at least 2 of the words that Paul uses were words that the art critics of his day would have used to describe, like say, a poem or a Greek play or Greek comedy or tragedy. They would have used at least two of those words if they were giving favorable reviews, right? If they're giving, saying this is something of beauty. As Christians, especially in a world that is so overshadowed by the ugly realities of what sin is and what it can do, and the brokenness of our world, and the sometimes the hopelessness and the despair. Sometimes we need beauty. Sometimes we need to be contemplating, whether it's going to the coast and seeing the beautiful scenery there, whether it's listening to a piece of good music or artwork or something of that sort, beauty. Think on what is beautiful. And then Paul, again, he echoes that promise. He says, and the God of peace will be with you. When you're being prayerful, bringing your needs and requests to God with thanksgiving, when you're thinking through truth, righteousness, and beauty in a way that leads you to be obedient, Paul says that gives you peace. Now, some of you are thinking, well, that's easier said than done, right? It's easy to talk about contentment and joy and all those things, but that's easy to do. But when you get out into the real world, that's not always so easy to live that out. And there's a sense in which me standing up front and telling all of you, be content, rejoice. There's a part of you that says, well, that doesn't work. And it can even be discouraging because now, you're sent out of here and you might think, okay, I'm going to try this again. Then you feel like 2 days later, like, shoot, I didn't make it. It didn't happen. I want you to notice something. Paul goes on, verse 12. He repeats this. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in every case, whether well-fed, hungry, living in plenty or want. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. Number one, I always thought, that verse, I can do everything through him who gives me strength. You see that verse sometimes at graduation, sometimes at, these occasions when people are really getting pepped up for the future. And it's like, hey, you can do whatever you want. And I'll tell you, if that were true, maybe I would have gone on to become a professional hockey player or something like that. But of course, because, I'd love to do that. But Paul is not saying, just pick whatever you want and you can do it because God will bless you. It's not what he's saying. He's saying there's a way in every condition, in every circumstance of life, that you can experience contentment. All things doesn't mean anything in the whole world you can just put your mind to it and you'll do it. No, Paul's saying in all conditions, there's a way to experience this contentment. But also notice what Paul says. He says, I have learned to be content. Paul didn't wake up one morning content, having it all figured out. Paul had to be a student of contentment. He had to be tutored in contentment. And do you know what tutored Paul? You know what his teacher was? It was that time his ship was shipwrecked and he was left in the ocean. They figured they were all probably going to die. It was being arrested and put on trial for his faith and being left in prison for weeks, months, years on end. It was those seasons in life where Paul wasn't sure if there was going to be food for him to eat. It was those times when he was thrown out of cities and beaten and bloodied because people didn't want to hear what he was talking about. Those were the tutors of contentment in Paul's life. Now, here's what that means for us. That means not one of us should expect to walk out this door and have contentment figured out by Friday. Not one of us is going to have contentment figured out by the end of the month, the end of the year. Contentment is really this lifelong process of learning. Now, Paul says, I've learned the secret of being content, and we're all thinking, great, tell us what it is. But you go on and Paul doesn't actually say anything. He doesn't say much more about what contentment is, which can be a little frustrating. He's telling us rejoice. He's saying be content. He's showing us how we can go about contentment. He's giving us little clues, but you're kind of left wondering, at least if you're like me, you're saying, I wish Paul would say a little more. Well, again, I'm glad you asked because Paul does say more. The reason he doesn't say it here is because he's already spelled it out in the earlier part of the book. If you have your Bible still open, you can flip back a page, or we'll put the text up on the screen. It's in Philippians chapter 3. And in Philippians chapter 3, Paul says, I consider everything a loss compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them garbage, rubbish, that I may gain Christ. You hear what Paul is saying there? Paul is saying contentment is never tied to what you have. It's never tied to what you experience. It's never tied to your accomplishments. It's never tied to your achievements. It's never tied to your gold, silver, bronze medal. It's never tied to your A on the paper or the D on the paper. It's not tied to how you do professionally. It's not tied to how many letters do you have after your name and your degree. It's not tied to any of those things that the world says you need to have if you want to be content. Contentment is tied to your union with Christ, being found in Him. Knowing that because of Jesus, God looks straight at you and He doesn't see all of your mistakes and your failures and your shortcomings and your guilt and your shame. He doesn't see any of that. He sees you as righteous in Christ. He looks at you and sees you as perfect, and He loves you as His child. He gives you contentment because, as he says earlier in the text, the Lord is near. He's so near. In fact, you are joined to Jesus. He is that near to you in the present moment right now. And your future is the eternal presence of God in a renewed and perfected and glorified world. Your future does not hinge on what you have or what you own. Your ultimate future is the glory of God in His presence for the rest of eternity. Union with Christ, past, present, future. That is your contentment. That means you can say, take whatever I have, take it away. I may lose it tomorrow, but I still have Christ. I'm still found in Him. It's been said, I think it was, I forgot to fact check this, but the quote is accurate. I think the person is accurate, but it's a person named Alan Redpath who said, you'll never know that Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. That's the secret of being content. That's what puts to death and destroys any hint of coveting and wanting something else. And if I just had that, then I'd be happy. And if my life went that direction, I could rejoice. And if my plans worked out that way, I could rejoice. No. You have Christ. You are found in Him. He is near you. Your future is secure with Him. That, brothers and sisters, is how we can be content, how we can rejoice in all.